is a ISHOR is a collective and which is primarily a network of researchers and scholars from Kerala working all over the country and abroad. And we have a shared interest in Kerala's broader cultures and histories in the Indian Ocean world. And this program, webinar series titled Intersection and Co-Influences, it's actually a flagship program of ISHOR Collective. And today we have the 14th program in our this webinar series, which in fact started in March 2021, and we have our first webinar by historian Jose Gomez, and our last program, which happened last March, in which we have the social historian and cultural historian Dr. Bindu Menon. Now today we have this lecture will be delivered by Dr. Ophira Gamliel, who teaches with University of Glasgow, and she is also accompanied by kind of a panel discussion accompanied by Meydad Eliyahu and Yehoshua Eliyahu and Orna Eliyahu, and these are the academicians, artists, and intellectuals tracing their history back to the Kochi Jews. And today's presentation is titled "The Lost Jew Town of Cochin: Rewinding Historical Erasure and Orientalist Palaces." And I welcome all of you to this program, and especially Ophira and her friends and comrades. So I also welcome all of you, and Dr. Jenee Peter of Aluva UC College History Department, a well-known archaeologist, and she's actually handling, chairing, or moderating this session. I welcome all of you and invite Dr. Jenee Peter to chair and moderate the session. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Abhilash. Good evening, everyone. So, Union Christian College in its centenary year is happy to associate with ISHOR because it's a bunch of young scholars on multidisciplinary initiatives on the studies of Indian Ocean communities and the Indian Ocean world. And we started with Dr. T.A. Punnen, who is our first professor to join. And from that time onwards, so we look forward to this as an opportunity to renew our commitment to this study. So very happy to be here with all of you today. And let me give a brief introduction to today's presentation. We will be having two presentations. The first one by Dr. Ophira, that will be for 30 minutes, and along with Meydad, which will be for about 10 minutes. And then we will move on to the second presentation by Orna, about 20 minutes. And Yehoshua will be joining us for the discussion part. Let me give a brief introduction to Dr. Ophira Gamliel. We all know about, we know her quite well, particularly those scholars who are working in Kerala know her a lot, but still, there are a lot of students in attending today's program. Ophira is a lecturer in South Asian religions at the University of Glasgow, and she specializes in Kerala history, religion, culture, Malayalam language and literature, particularly on Jewish Malayalam. And she tries to situate the Kerala Jewish history in the broader context of Malabar history and Indian Ocean maritime trade networks. Meydad has not joined us. We hope to have him soon. He's an artist, a curator, and an activist. And he has his works have featured in the Kochi Jews Biennale and also in the Wilfrid Israel Museum of Asian Art and Studies in 2020. So I hope we can move on to the presentation. Dr. Ophira.
Yes, thank you very much. Let me just share the screen. Thank you so much for your kind introduction and for hosting us. and also for adjusting to a little bit slightly different presentation than usual. So one of the reasons I wanted my colleagues to be on board, and this is all I'm going to explain now, is because Meydad, Yehoshua, and I wrote together an article that is about to be published about the lost Jew town of Kochi. This was actually during the first lockdown, so we were working online in different countries. And while working together, the trigger I will explain shortly was the collapse of Kadavumbhagam Synagogue in Kochi. And we thought it's good that we'll start putting together what we know, each one of us separately. And it's not really my thing, material culture. So I was kind of going into an adventure with them, and I really need them on board. And at the same time, Orna was writing an article about the synagogues in Kerala, by and large, with Barbara Johnson, one of the most prominent scholars of Kerala Jews for many, many years. And their article was published, and I thought it's good if we incorporate some of Orna's very, very interesting findings from the 1990s and the early 2000s. So what I'm going to talk about is the historical erasure and Orientalist fallacies that basically, the way I see it, have been blocking the study of Kerala Jews for many years. And I think it's time to rewind them and to go back to the history and the evidence that we do have and retell more, in my view, reliable and interesting and convincing history. So let's start from Jewtown Road in Cochin. The Mattancherry Palace, as Pius Malek Kandadil writes, was founded in 1555, mid-16th century. And just below, just a little bit to the south of the palace, there is the Paradesi synagogue, the well-known white Jewish synagogue, so-called white Jewish synagogue. And actually, there is no inscription and there are no documents, to the best of my knowledge, that can date this synagogue to a specific date. It's conventionally believed that the synagogue was established in 1568. Then a few houses down the road, there used to be an older synagogue that has an inscription dated 1489. And this synagogue, when the community members, the name of the synagogue is Tekkumbhagam Synagogue, when the community members left to Israel, it was completely dismantled and demolished around 1958. The circumstances of this demolition are, they still need to be properly investigated. We don't exactly know, but it seems that members of the community itself decided to demolish their own synagogue, which is a strong statement in my view. And then a little bit more to the south, there is Kadavumbhagam Synagogue right next to the landing hut, Kadavu. And it had 3 inscriptions dated 1344, 1543-04, and then the 1550s. It suffered, after the community members migrated to Israel, it suffered gradual decline. So we're talking about 1957 until 2019 when the facade collapsed. And that's more or less after that we started working on the article. And it suffered also incremental dismantling. I'm kind of differentiating between decline, which is a gradual process, and dismantling, which is taking bits and pieces of the building. So at first, what was taken was the ark, and I hope that Meydad joins us shortly, and he's going to talk about the beautiful ark of that synagogue and what happened to it once it was transmitted to Israel, after it was shipped to Israel. In 1972, the breezeway and the bridge were demolished in order to give way to expanding the road. And in the 1990s, the Israeli Museum, and I think Orna is going to mention it, the Israeli Museum initiated another process of dismantling and shipping the beautiful wooden ceiling and other wooden parts of the synagogue. And I thought it's good also to see on the map Chembitapalli Mosque, because, well, this mosque, according to Meydad and Natalie Shukohi, was built and constructed in the early 16th century between the 1520s and the 1540s. Maybe some of you have better information. But the reason I mentioned this mosque is look how close it is to Kadavumbhagam. And one interesting issue about this mosque is that the elders of the mosque have this tradition, oral tradition, that it was a Jew from the nearby synagogue who donated the teak wood to construct their roof, which is a very interesting thing to, I think, to keep in mind as we proceed. So our question is as follows, or something happens to the, okay. You see, the Paradesi synagogue is very well known. All of you know it, I guess. And it is also very well cherished, preserved, and celebrated. In the 1968, the Indian government stamped a stamp in its honor. So I don't have to say much about that, right? You all know that synagogue, I guess. But this is Kadavumbhagam. Tekkumbhagam is no more, okay? But there was still a synagogue standing for all those decades nearby that reached this miserable state of affairs in 2019. And the question that triggered our joint collaborative research was why? What makes one monument so well cherished, celebrated, famous, and preserved, and the other one is neglected in such a way? And I'm going to posit some possibilities. Well, I think it has a lot to do with the way the synagogue communities are labeled. So we have the Paradesi synagogue community is labeled as white, right? White Jews. Whereas all the other communities in Kerala are labeled as Black Jews. The notions of whiteness and blackness have a lot to do with this differentiation between the monuments and the cultural heritage. This is one thing, but these notions also bring with them a whole, list of stereotypes and stigmas that are accepted, unfortunately, as some kind of a conventional wisdom. So the first is that the white Jews or the Paradesi Jews, and please remember when I'm talking about white and black here, it's like with double commas, okay? I just feel the need to repeat this because I think it has a lot to do with those labels. So the white Jews are supposed to have sound historical consciousness. They are, whatever they say is accepted, without even, that's okay, oral traditions, legends, whatever, but they must have a grain of truth. Whereas the Black Jews, they have no historical sources. One. Two, the white Jews, why are they white? Because they are considered to be descendants of Iberian refugees, right? Whereas the Black Jews, they have their origins shrouded in mystery. We don't really know where they popped up, how these communities emerged. And then we have this idea that the white Jews were persecuted by the Portuguese, whereas, the Black Jews didn't have anything to worry about because they were an isolated community, right? Nobody even noticed that there are other types of Jews there. And it goes on to have, is it me that is doing all those marking on the screen? And they have this idea that when the Dutch took over, they rescued the white Jews from the Portuguese who persecuted them, whereas those Black Jews always mingled with local people, they didn't even need any rescue or anything. And you have also this idea that because the white Jews are descendants of Iberian refugees, converts or whatever, new Christians, they retain this Sephardi, prestigious Sephardi Andalusian heritage, whereas the Black Jews, they needed, the Dutch, they needed the Portuguese, the new Christians, they needed the contact with European Jews that started when the Portuguese arrived in Kerala at first in order to revive their Jewishness, because their Jewishness was stagnating. And therefore, that explains, according to researchers, why do we have this very unique and separatist community, the Paradesi or the white Jews, whereas all the other Malabari so-called Jews, or politically correct speaking, are a homogeneous majority group. You know, these people intermarry, these people are endogamous, so we have one on that side and the other on that side. And of course, it has to do also with economy. The white Jews are considered to be very rich and influential, and the others are all kind of poor and underprivileged. And I think all these are stereotypes related to those labels, black and white. And I also think that the stereotypes grew with the colonialist expansion in Kerala, and they reached the climax during the British period. And now I'm going to discuss the evidence. The problem is in the history of Kerala Jews is that always they start the end of the 17th century with the first contacts with the Paradesi Jews, and then they read anachronistically the history. And my point is that we have to look at the historical evidence, which is there, and to start where it starts and not try to read all kinds of legends and stories from the 18th century backwards. So here is one example. I mean, we'll start here because this has to do with Cochin, this inscription. And also you will see while I am looking at that evidence, it's not the only evidence, but that this evidence also shows us how history was manipulated and erased. So this inscription dated 1344, which is according to Anno Mundi in the Hebrew calendar. And I have to just stop for a second here and explain what is the difference between Anno Mundi and other systems of calendric dating. Because Anno Mundi, until the 16th century, was the practice to date inscriptions and documents in Europe. Asian Jews, North Africa, Levant, the Arabian Peninsula, Central Asia, I think also, used the era of contracts or Seleucid era, which start 312 before Common Era. That was the normal practice. So we can tell by this dating, Anno Mundi, that whoever is responsible for this inscription came from Europe, either from the Western Mediterranean or Western Europe or somewhere else in Europe. So this is one thing. The other thing is that this synagogue, it is a synagogue inscription. We don't know who is the donor. We just know the date, 1344. It is currently pasted on the inner compound wall of the Paradesi synagogue. And there is this slab explaining that this inscription belonged to the synagogue in Kochangadi, which is the oldest synagogue in Kochi. Okay, so far so good. And now I have to speak on behalf of Yehoshua. That's what he started. When we started discussing the article between us, he asked me, did you notice that there was another inscription just near this one? I said, no. And he sent me this picture. Just a minute, I have a problem here. Okay, he sent me, somebody photographed him between these two inscriptions. It's very easy, you know, it's like a supermarket trick that they put all the costly products, you know, the height of the average height of a person's eyes. So you see first the costly products, right? So this is what all of us immediately see. And we fail to notice that there's another one there, or we notice maybe what we don't remember. We remember this one. And then, okay, this one, first of all, it's important to note, is dated according to the Seleucid era or era of contracts. But now we are already deep into the 16th century. And by that time, many Jews in the Asian sphere and the Arabic speaking world already shifted to Anno Mundi. So it looks like, I don't want to commit to that, but it looks like the people who donated this inscription were affiliated with Yemen. Only Yemeni Jews continued to use Seleucid era. I don't want to commit to that, but obviously this is a network of merchants that is affiliated to the Arab world, possibly Yemen in particular. This is one thing. The other thing is that the donors actually are not Arabs. Jacobean Rabbi David Castiel, Castilla means this is somebody from Spain, this is one thing. And the other person named is Baruch Levi, that from later documents, we know his family migrated to Kerala from Germany. Okay, so we have two European Jews using the Yemeni calendric systems or maybe the Oriental so-called calendric system. The other thing is that, there is no, you might imagine that this inscription belonged to the Paradesi synagogue, right? Because it doesn't say it came from elsewhere. And then Yehoshua tells me, you see, that's wrong. This inscription, he says, belonged to Kadavumbhagam. I have a photo to prove, I have a proof, he says. He bought this photo, so he has this proof, before everybody forgets where this inscription comes from. And this is a photo of Kadavumbhagam Synagogue before it was, before the community left. And you can see the same inscription here. I hope you can see, because on my screen, the photos, the gallery of your faces is right on that. So I hope everybody can see. You can just raise your hand if you need a clarification. So the thing is that, you see, we think that to be, honest and decent, you should also write here where this inscription comes from, right? This is one thing. Another thing, now we start digging, right? Okay, so wait a minute. What about this Kochangadi synagogue, right? Where is this Kochangadi synagogue? So here is the thing, and now we started digging into documents. There is a catalog of Hebrew and Aramaic inscriptions from India, prepared by David Sassoon, not only stone or copper or whatever wood inscriptions, but also documents, records, etc., a very thick volume of the catalog with some words about each document. And that was prepared in 1932. David Sassoon had a home in Kochi also. So he, of course, was a Hebrew scholar. He could read himself. And when he records this inscription, the so-called Kochangadi inscription, he writes that it is currently, in 1932, stored in Kadavumbhagam Synagogue. This is Kadavumbhagam Synagogue, okay? Now, I think if this inscription was stored there, it belonged to that synagogue, right? And if you ask, okay, what did he do at the attic, right? Because this inscription, the newer inscription from the 16th century, commemorates the construction of a wall, which is probably this structure. And you archaeologists and material culture scholars, you probably, you can vouch for me when I say that this is the custom, right? To expand those old buildings, either demolish and build a new one, but the site remains the same site, right? So it's probably that in mid-16th century, Castiel and Levy actually donated some funding for expanding this synagogue. And when they did it, the synagogue community removed the older inscriptions, stored it in the attic, right? And put the new one, it's better, it's new, right? But, oops, I'm sorry, just a minute. But David Sassoon writes that actually this 1344 inscription didn't belong to Kadavumbhagam. The people of Kadavumbhagam took it from another synagogue that was burned by Tipu Sultan. So now let me ask you, historians, any evidence that Tipu Sultan might have burned a synagogue in Kochi? Did he reach Kochi? I was asking that question. I started digging, and as far as I am aware, he never reached Kochi. So how could he have burned a synagogue? And David Sassoon doesn't write, what is his source. He's a good scholar. He doesn't write what is his source, and obviously he heard it from somebody. And I can tell you that many scholars are still looking for Kochangadi synagogue. Now, I'm not saying there was no Kochangadi synagogue. There probably, maybe, possibly was, I don't know. But if this inscription was stored in the attic of that synagogue, my common sense tells me that it belonged to that synagogue. And I call Kochangadi synagogue a historical ghost. This is a way of diverting the attention from Kadavumbhagam and its historical importance into something that doesn't exist. And naturally, at some point, one of the Paradesi Jews in Kochi told me that their synagogue is built on the ruins of Kochangadi, so it's just a matter of 1, 2, 3 more generations, and this information is lost. Okay, now we have to go to again, back to the 14th century. Cochin, Pudu Viper, that's a term probably familiar to all of you, the new piece that was added, right? 1341, a big flood or something happened, but Pudu Viper, now I'm also digging into that a little bit, apparently, according at least to the Palliparambil Grantavari, that year was established as the beginning of settlement in Kochi and Vaipi. So this is the earliest period in which people settle in Kochi. And just 1 or 2 years later, we have this interesting reference from Ibn Battuta that a lot of the secondary sources about Kerala Jews cite. But it's good to have a look at the, at least the printed Arabic version, if not to have a look into the manuscripts. And even Battuta, completely traumatized by a cyclone that hit the port of Calicut and the ship that he had his own, concubines and slaves and property and presents from the Sultan of Delhi, that Chinese junk that had all his stuff and belongings took off because of this stormy season. And he was chasing his own, that ship with a smaller boat, riding Fi el Nahar by the water. And he rides 10 days journey from Calicut to Kolam. And it looks like, I read those passages with my colleague Ines Weinrich. My Arabic is very poor, but with her we managed to read it. It's very interesting. And it looks like they were traveling via the backwaters, which also make sense, or the inland rivers and lagoons. It makes sense because if it is the stormy season, it might be too risky to travel by the ocean. And halfway between Calicut and Kolam, they reach this place. And that's what he writes. On the 5th day of our journey, we reached Kunji Kari. And this is, now I'm going to read another sentence that is skipped in all the translations, but I think it's very important also because I love linguistics, but even Battuta says, this is how you vocalize, right? Arabic has no vowels. With its name vocalized with a rounded vowel on the kaf, a silent noon, a jim with a lengthened ya, a kaf with an open vowel, and the ra'a with a closed front vowel and the ya. What does it mean? It means that, for his listeners, he wants them to know more or less how to pronounce the name. It also means that, of course, he didn't write the text, he was dictating it, and he was dictating it many years after he was in Cochin, present there. Is it Cochin? Okay, so let me attribute credit, the people who realize this is Cochin is Meydad and Natalie Shukoi. They say, yes, Kunji Kari, that must be Cochin, because the old name of Cochin is Kochangadi, right? The small market. Kunji in the mid-14th century might have been a Tamil influenced pronunciation of Koche, right? Kunje. This is one. Meydad Shukoi thinks that Kari comes from a North Indian word. I'm not sure about it. I don't know. We have to think about it. He thinks it is Gari. I think it is simply an Arabicized form of Kochangadi, Kunji Kari. Quite consistently in Arabic, and especially in Ibn Battuta, when you have da, it is replaced by ra in Arabic. Now, what does he see there? He says, it is on the top of a mountain. That's the problem we have. All the sources that cite this reference to say it couldn't be Cochin because Kochi has no mountain, right? So where is it? Maybe Chenamangalam, maybe Kodungalur, maybe. And then he continues, where the Jews live, and they have a prince, Amir, one of their own, and they pay taxes to the king, Sultan of Kolam. Why does he say it is on top of the mountain? It's another issue. We leave it at the moment. We have to think about it. Maybe he doesn't. Maybe it's a later edition. I don't know. But it's difficult to think of another place because we do have an inscription from 1344 from Kochi of a synagogue that is constructed there in collaboration with Jews from Europe. And why does Ibn Battuta even refer to Jews in that area? In all the 30 years or something of his journey, he mentions all over Asia, right? He mentions Jews only 2 times, except for this one. at the court of the Anatolian king, where a Jewish doctor, according to Ibn Battuta, desecrated the Quran, and then in Damascus, because Jews and Christians and the Muslims pray together to avert a plague, something maybe we can empathize with these days, and then in Cochin. So his interest is not in Jews. His interest is, I read it like that, is in telling his audience in Morocco, in Fez, a few decades after, look, there's a new market town and there are potential partners, business partners for you there, which are the Jews, right? El Yahud. Now look at Kadavumbhagam again. Now it is an image taken after the facade collapsed. And you can see that this synagogue is directly connected with the Ghat, the Kadavu, right? So this synagogue was obviously established with this idea in mind that they are going to have to manage international trade. And this is, I think, very interesting. Now I need to wrap up. So I just need a few more minutes to talk about Tekkumbhagam Pali and its inscription. As I said, Tekkumbhagam Pali is 1489, but all the secondary sources will tell you that it is established sometime in the 17th century. There are different 1667, all kinds of strange dates. That's not clear where they are coming from. And again, Yehoshua was kind of provoking my thinking with his questions. He said, look, the Paradesi Jews, can you imagine, that was before we realized there is an inscription really. He said, can you imagine that they will let, if this is the Paradesi synagogue, the white Jewish synagogue, can you imagine they will let Black Jews build a synagogue in their midst if the Paradesi synagogue is earlier? So we started looking at the map. We keep on thinking that we need proper evidence, right? And this is something that everybody, prides themselves in, that the king gave this plot of land to the Jews. So if the palace is 1555, clearly the Paradesi Pali is later, right? But why did they need a plot of land from the king, right? Because this whole street was already crowded with so-called Black Jews or the Tekkumbhagam Pali community. The interesting thing is by the 20th century, this whole street was populated by white Jews. And it was a strange thing to see that the synagogue community had to come from different parts of Cochin in order to pray in their own synagogue. It's not normal. So something fishy here. This is one thing. The other thing is that there is an inscription, and the inscription is recorded and transcribed by the same David Sassoon in his catalog on the same page that he has the 1344 inscription, right? That he says came from Kadavumbhagam. And this is the strange thing. This is the kind of, dissonance, something like a cognitive dissonance, because it is okay to accept what he says without any references that Tipu Sultan burned the Kochangadi synagogue. That is taken, on its face value. But when you ask researchers, why don't you consider that there was already a synagogue, another synagogue? There were two synagogues in Cochin in the 16th century, Tekkumbhagam and Kadavumbhagam. Why do you ignore that Tekkumbhagam synagogue? There is an inscription transcribed in David Sassoon, and they say, oh, well, we don't know about this inscription. It's a strange inscription, we don't know, and it's lost. Luckily, or I don't know if it's a big luck, but somehow, miraculously, this inscription, and this is the inscription, it was discovered in some infrastructure excavations. We are not sure what, the circumstances are a bit blurry, in 2017, and luckily we were lucky enough, and we are very grateful to Tawfiq Zakaria, who sent us an image of this inscription. We don't know who is the current custodian. We know it is somewhere in Cochin. We don't know where precisely, maybe in the same site, I don't know, but we have an image. We have a proof that David Sassoon was not imagining, So I don't see any ways but to understand that this is the date of foundation. And the donor, and that's another thing, the donor is Jacob Castiel. The Seleucid era is the dating. So we have a Jew from Castilla, probably arriving already a few years earlier to that, networking with local Jews to establish another synagogue community. And all this happens 9 years before the Portuguese even first set foot in India. What does it mean? Now I wrap up, and I hope that Meydad is already here. I don't know. Let's rewind this historical erasure, and let's start with the stigmas. If we say that the Black Jews, so-called, have no historical sources, I hope that even the little bit that I touch, and believe me, there is much more. Yes, there are historical sources. We just have to read them and relate to them seriously. Their origins are shrouded in mystery. No, we have ongoing evidence, actually since the 9th century, of itinerary Jewish merchants, and during the Geniza period, it's clearly becoming more and more Jews visiting the area and some of them settling there. So we can't say it's shrouded in mystery. It's very clear what the picture is. That they were an isolated community, you know, that myth of isolation is a colonialist orientalist trope, you know. No, it was a cosmopolitan community. They had contacts since the 14th century at least, you know, not only with the Arabic speaking world, but even beyond. Then the idea that they mingled with local people, well, of course, what's wrong with that? You know, it's actually very nice, don't you think? And then that their Jewishness was revived by encounter with European Jews. Well, they didn't need any revival. There were Yemeni and other European Jews, you know, from other places in the diaspora already there, from Egypt, you know, we sometimes even have names. That they were a homogeneous majority group. I will not go into much details, but no, there are very different historical circumstances just with these two synagogues in Kochi, Tekkumbhagam and Kadavumbhagam. And finally, that they were poor and underprivileged. Well, they were affluent communities, at least in certain periods, and they had also their own very rich businessmen for leaders. And I'll stop here. I don't know if Meydad is already here. No? I think I saw Yehoshua. Well, it looks like Meydad is not. Ah, here he is. Good. So Meydad, you can now just step in. The next slide is yours. Please unmute yourself.
Yeah. Hello. Hi, everyone. First of all, it's my honor to be part of this respected forum, and thank you, Ophira, for your, fascinating facts. You know, each time I hear this information, mainly, between us when we doing our research, it's amazing how much layers there are, in the history of our community. I'll just say a short introduction that, my journey, both physical and the research I did, both the artistic research and the other research, started 6 years ago when I came first time to Cochin with my father, who was born in Ernakulam. And one of the first things I did before we traveled to Cochin was I was trying to understand where my family came from and what is the history, which wasn't, even at the time, wasn't so easy. There are a few sources, many of them had different stories and different narratives. But one amazing fact was, and we can see it here now in the slideshow, is the the Ark of Torah from Nechalim. Now it's in Nechalim, which is a non-Kuchini, it's a European Jewish village. You might confuse it with Nevatim, which is a different one, which is based on immigrants from Kerala. But Nechalim had this amazing Ark of Torah. I must say that none of the synagogues in Israel have this type of arks, such a glorious and fascinating piece of art. As an artist, I appreciate it, I think even more. When I saw it in person, I was amazed from the narrative, which I actually discovered later, which this Ark of Torah came to Nechalim as a gift from the state of Israel. Even though later on I discovered it was imported to Israel by Yaakov Madai, the Gabbai, the one who managed the synagogue, the Kadavumbhagam Synagogue. So from the left, we can see this synagogue in its glorious time. And we know this Ark of Torah was donated by the Maharaja of Cochin in 1937, which is an amazing fact we found in a historic Jewish newspaper. And this was given in 1957 to the village by the state, even though to the Gabbai of the synagogue, when he came to Israel in 1954, it was told that he had to pay for it because it was stored in the tax offices for so long. And I think this story, even though it's still so provocative in my eyes, so many years after that, it tells the story of the community in many ways, how the synagogue and all the heritage we had, most of the heritage got split from different sources, different museums, different villages which we don't have any connection to. And this brings many questions about how we keep our heritage today. And I think the correction Ophira is doing with the narrative, such a famous narrative of the Jew town of Cochin. When I started, this is one of the things that motivated me to try to understand how things are and to face the fact that we have, amazing monumental and historical sites that are being abandoned and destroyed with time. So, Ophira, if you can, I'll start. The first project I did was in Kashi Gallery as part of the Kochi Biennale 2016. It was called the Box of Documents. And it was kind of an archive that I created first in Israel and then exhibited for the first time in Cochin. It was actually used by, included many different items, including books, old photographs. We can see it in the slides. And it was designed as kind of a space. First of all, it was an historical space, so it fit very well in, but also the black as something that is unknown, that you already also always discover new things. And I was happy also by the participation of the audience, which was an important part of the project. So this project also included painting I did. Here you can see a photograph of my own community, where it's my grandfather on the left with my aunt in his arm. And this photo was hanged many years in my parents' house, but not so many answers about who were the people and what was the heritage. And later on, this project, which had a lot of impact, both in Israel and in India, the curator of this project was Namya Abraham from the Kashi Gallery. We also collaborated for the next project, which had the more public appearance. So Red Crown Green Parrot, it's a collaboration with Taufik Zakaria, and it's basically a street art or public art project in the street of the historical and razed Jew town of Cochin. You can see in the next slide the map we created. And it was amazing to see so many historical sites being abandoned and being forgotten in comparison with probably one of the most touristic sites of that part of India, which is the Paradesi synagogue. So we can see the route of around 500 meters from the Paradesi synagogue to the Tekkumbhagam Synagogue. And my motivation when I travel, in one of the time I traveled, was I discovered the Tekkumbhagam Synagogue, and I was amazed that this ancient synagogue being abandoned and left to get destroyed with the weather, which unfortunately happened later. So this project happened really quickly in many ways. We chose motifs that are associated both with the local culture, but also with the Jewish community, like the parrots, which are very central in the Jewish women songs. And it was an amazing project. First of all, the collaboration with the locals who are, as you all know, are not Jewish anymore, but also the attention we got from locals and the collaboration we had and the help we got. And this facade, you see it, and it's part of, it seems as part of the historic synagogue, but actually it's a later addition made by cement. I don't think I would even bother, you know, this, I do respect this site very much. So the fact that it was all cement allowed us to do our intervention in the space. So the project was based on 3 languages, Hebrew, Malayalam, and English, and we used different women's songs related to this site. So these songs, for example, that we use here, was dedicated to this synagogue, which was very important and very site-specific. And another, and this facade, I think only it was around 6 months later that it was collapsed with the rains. But also we marked other sites. One of them was in front of Sarah Cohen's house, which was the Tekkumbhagam Synagogue, which at the time, and I think still today, don't have any traces of the important and ancient synagogue that was there in the past. So we used this song that dedicated to this synagogue as well as the motif of the Ark of Torah, which also now it's not in the community hands but in the hands of the Magnus Museum in the United States. So first of all, of course, our project and my project are a lot about the history and the heritage, but they are also bringing this subject to discussion and put light on these sites, which and this history. Yeah, this for example is based on my great grandfather, which was a gabbai of the Orna synagogue, and he did succeed to come to Israel. He passed away in Kerala a few months before he was supposed to come. And one important part of this route that we created was actually to bring a public discussion, and we did had an amazing tours with local tourists, experts that join us. With very emotional discussions about the history and about how we actually, our history is being erased for so many years and until today is being forgotten. I want to thank to the authorities in Kerala that since the collapse happened, they did build a roof on the top of the synagogue, and they have plans to restore it, which is very good for all of us in so many ways. Thank you.
Thank you, Meydad. So I'll stop sharing now. Thank you very much for this introduction to your work. We can perhaps later put some links to Meydad's work and this project. It's available online. Yes, and Jenny, can you please introduce Orna? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. We will, there's lots to discuss, so I'm sure we should save a lot of space for the open discussion. So let us continue with the presentation too. We have Orna Eliyahu, Oron here. She's a ceramic artist based in Seattle in the US. Born in Israel to parents who had arrived from Ernakulam. She holds a bachelor's degree in archaeology, master's in Jewish art history, and she has done extensive fieldwork in Kerala and has documented the ancient Torah Ark remains. So I invite Orna for continuing with her presentation.
Thank you. Let me share the screen. Okay. Thank you for inviting me to speak. Sorry. Thank you for inviting me to speak today. I will be talking about the Synagogue of Kerala, emphasizing the 3 synagogues from Kochi. I will be also talk about the Torah arcs and how they can help us understand the relationship between Malabar Jews and the rest of the Jewish world. In 1950, before the great migration of Kerala Jews to Israel, we had 8 functioning synagogues. Although each synagogue is unique, they share a general layout. They were built as a walled complex with 3 main structures along an east-west axis. A gatehouse, the main synagogue's building, and in between a breeze house connecting the 2. Against the west wall of the synagogue in this area, there is was the Torah ark, the most sacred element in the synagogue, storing the holy Torah. The gatehouse was a 2-story building. Here you can see the Kochi synagogues. The upper story was used for Torah studies and community meeting. Also, the women used the upper floor to access the breezeway to go to the women's section on the 2nd floor of the synagogue hall. Here is the breezeway. The men walked under it, while the women above them. The main synagogue hall is a large, monumental, 2-story high, facing west to Jerusalem. In the middle, there is a large pulpit known as Teba, surrounded by brass columns. Also unique to Kerala synagogues, in the back, there is another Teba in the gallery, used only for Shabbat and holidays. Men sat around the walls on the wooden benches, and some sat around the Teba. In the Paradesi, there are also extra benches in the middle. The building has large windows allowing daylight, but at night, there were a lot of oil lamps that later replaced by electricity. The oil lamps were dominant and made the space festive. The ceiling is also decorated. The most impressive ceiling is from Kadavumbhagam. It was dated to 16th century. You can see some of the details and the wood carving, thick wood carving. I will jump fast to the Torah arcs. Now we will focus on the Torah arcs. In my research, I identified 11 Torah arcs. Some just fragments. I classified them to 6 styles labeled A to F. The 4 earlier styles show clear Jewish Italian influence. This picture on the right, in 1996, in a research trip to Kerala, together with my advisor, Professor Ehud Netzer, we found a facade of an ancient Torah ark made of heavy teak wood and brass hinges still intact. This Torah ark didn't look like any of the one we knew till then. From the interviews with synagogue elders, I learned that it was in use till 1939. It was a large, dark, freestanding cabinet standing on a podium. According to one elder, there was probably an inscription on the top. Here, the same Torah ark, reconstructed, standing again in the main synagogue hall. The carpenters added a few panels and rebuilt the cabinet structure behind the facade. The only other place where I found a freestanding cabinet or Torah arks was Northeast Italy in the late 15th and to early 16th century. The one on the left from Modena from 1472 is particularly similar to Ernakulam ark. On the bottom, two manuscripts from the same region in Italy and the same time period, showing synagogues in prayers, synagogue interior with the freestanding flat top Torah arks. Now we jump to looking again at Kochi synagogues. If you visited the Paradesi synagogue, you probably saw the Torah ark on the right. The left one, originally from Mattancherry Tekkumbhagam Synagogue, is stored at the Magnus Museum in Berkeley, California. It's rarely displayed because it is taller than the museum ceiling. So you can see how it is monumental. Unlike the type A in Ernakulam, the type D is a facade hiding a niche in the wall where the Torah cases were placed. The design and the decoration are also very different from type A. You can see that the two arks are very similar to each other. This indicates that they were built roughly around the same time. However, small details hint that one was older than the other. Take you about to show the two different parts. Looking at the gable. In the middle, there is a medallion with Hebrew inscription, the Torah crown. The Tekkumbhagam version is more three-dimensional, the Paradesi more flat. Also, all the elements above and around the medallion, the flowers, the bases, the fabric, it's in the Paradesi is more flat, more schematic, and the other, we have also other details that are not shown here that suggest that the Tekkumbhagam ark was older and the Paradesi ark was probably copied from it. Here are two Torah arks from Italy from 16th and 17th century with greatly similar designs and motifs. In the middle, you can see one way in which the design might have arrived to Malabar. This is the front of the front page of Haggadah, a Passover ceremony book. The actual ark design would have been sent from your European communities or sketched by visitors. The sketches were given to local artisans. From what I know, they were Hindu. They worked in the synagogue under close supervisions. By the 17th century, the local artisans were already familiar with European styles. They had books of designs to make woodwork, for example, to export. They also made similar design in the local churches, like these two altars from Kochi region. You can also see similar use of color and gilding in these churches. In conclusion, the three Kochi synagogues were constructed with the same layout, shared common motive, and followed the similar ritual and cultural use patterns. Also, the Torah arcs from type A to D show ongoing connection with northern Italy, possibly as early as 15th century. This suggests that even before Paradesi synagogue construction, Kerala Jews maintained independent contact with the Jewish community as far away as Europe. Thank you. Try to do it as fast as possible.
Jenny, you're on mute. We can't hear you.
Thank you, Orna. So now we move on to the discussion part. We have time till 8 p.m. So we have got almost 30 minutes. And in these two presentations, we have been reminded about those erasures, the historical erasures that has taken place. We have Ophira and Meydad have, separated the shaft and the grave, and told us about the historical goals and all the other. And the second presentation gave us an overview of the architectural elements, art elements, and how we can actually use these as solid evidence and situate, unlike the conventional historiography that we follow at the moment. So I'm sure there will be a lot of questions. Dear participants, please use the chat box, or you can raise your hands and ask your questions. Please be brief. Yeah. I saw somebody raising their hands. Yes, Anu wanted to ask a question. Yes, Meenakshi, yes, please. Please unmute and ask. Meenakshi, please unmute and ask.
Hi, thank you for this very interesting presentation. I had a question for Ophira, which is, could you provide us, this is a particular interest of mine, with a quick snapshot of Dutch, Portuguese, Jewish relations inside Fort Kochi around the 17th century?
Okay, thank you, Meenakshi, for this question. Actually, I'm not the right person to answer it. I think Anjana Singh, and I wish she were here, would probably give you a better qualified answer. I can just tell you what I heard from her, that during the Dutch period, and actually that's when, I heard the lecture by her. Mahmoud was kind enough to invite me to a small workshop that she was present. And she was talking about those color categories that the Portuguese labeled in Cochin and Fort Cochin. And she was talking about the Dutch inheriting those categories. She was studying closely the Dutch documents. And I think that, it's first of all, I have to admit that I keep on, I'm very reluctant about going beyond the 16th century. I always find myself stuck before that. But it's time to move forward. So it's a study I still need to go. I can tell you bits of pieces of what so far I encountered in some documents and texts. The Dutch talk about and it's not Fort Kochi, it's Kochi General. So you had the Jews in Mattancherry and the Jewtown Road, so-called. They talk about in one of their documents, and please don't, forgive me that I don't have the reference offhand. I should really dig and find it. But I remember reading in one of the translations, I can't read Dutch, so I mean, I'll have to struggle a lot. So in one of the translations of the Dutch records of that period, they complain that there is this big merchant, Yehoshua, who is trying to monopolize the trade in Kochi. They actually complain about Rahabi. They are not very fond of him. And in some of the references that they talk about Jews, they are very, very racist, they are anti-Semites. Clear. and I have to say, I'm half Dutch. I'm very much fond of Dutch people, but this is the truth, it was a very, very racist reference. And also they complained about the Rahabi, which is important to keep in mind, because part of the kind of historical erasure is to make the Rahabi family very big and important, as if they were the leaders of the Jewish community, but actually he was a pretty shrewd merchant. And probably very much responsible to a process of separation. And I think that it is in that period, maybe slightly before the Dutch entered Cochin, that the process of kind of what becomes separation starts. I think that there was no such kind of ethnic-based, color-based, race-based separation between the Paradesi, which in Malayalam simply means, itinerant merchants, right? The Muslims had Paradesi merchants, and it was the same. There was no such clear-cut distinction between the local Jews and the Paradesis. This is one thing. The other thing is that we have this very interesting document by Moshe Pereira de Paiva that everybody, maybe you also heard about, that the Dutch governor invites, Pereira de Paiva came with two other merchants. He was a diamond merchant from Amsterdam. They came together to Surat for their diamond business. And the Dutch governor in Cochin invites them as wealthy Jews from Amsterdam to come and meet the Jews in Cochin. So this is also something to bear in mind, that when Jews come from Amsterdam in the late 17th century, they come to visit the Dutch governor and not the Paradesi Jews, as is often being portrayed. He visits them, and he compiles one of the earliest censuses, I think, in India, 1686. He is counting how many families, are in the Paradesi Jewish community, and he marks who is white and who is no category. Now, the question is, what does white mean in this census? Because it's 23 families, all are of the same community, right? But some of them are white and some of them are not, and it's about half. And when you look at the list, you see that you have 3 families from Germany, one is white, the others are not white. The Castiel, the only Spanish, only family in Cochin that directly arrived from the Iberian Peninsula, they are considered not white. So what does it mean, white and not white? Is it a color or is it another distinction? And that has to be, that has to be asked. This is something to still, to think about. But it's often represented as very simple, that this is a list of the white Jews. And they say, yeah, there are some strange issues there. We don't really figure out, but obviously this is like, the white Jewish communities. Castiels were already at that time, late 17th centuries, dispersed between 4 different communities. The inscriptions tell us this. There's another inscription from Parur. And probably they were not classified as white because they intermarried. They were probably descendants of intermarriage already. And it seems that the endogamous practices of the Paradesi Jews of later periods actually started at that period, when the Dutch were there, and intensified during the British period. And they, reached the climax when in the late 19th century, they built a separation wall for their cemetery. We didn't talk about the cemeteries, but that's another thing that Yehoshua was kind of, he really, maybe it's an engineer mind, that he sees all those little details and he says, did you notice that the tombstones of the Rahabi family were actually stored in the Paradesi synagogue courtyard, and they were put into the Paradesi cemetery only in 2018. So where did they take those tombstones from? And then we started thinking and realizing that the gate to the Paradesi synagogue was only built in the late 19th century, and there's an inscription commemorating it too, you know? So probably at that time, they moved the tombstones from the common cemetery grounds to their synagogue courtyard in order not to mix with the local Jews, right? So this is, well, I don't want to continue and I can just blabber and I should stop here.
I think we have a similar question from Aruni, SK Aruni. Just curious to know how were different layouts of urban townships between Jews and Portuguese, Dutch or English towns.
Can you please repeat the question? I couldn't hear you very well.
It's about the layout of urban townships, whether the Jew township was different from the Portuguese, Dutch or the English layout. Maybe inspired by your map, this question.
Oh, it's a wonderful question, and I would really like to know the answer too. You know, it's an urban studies project that it's a dream project that I would like to have with people who can read buildings, which I cannot. You know, people like Meydad and Natalie Shukoi, like yourself, like Orna, like people who archaeologists and art historians. But I would bet, you know, that you cannot say, I mean, the term Jewtown is probably a little bit because Jews were living there and not because it had any specific urban landscapes. They were all Malayalis, including the Paradesis, you know. They were all Malayalis, and they were probably practicing very similar practices like community living around their sacred space. And they have market town adjacent to their living quarters and the sacred space, etc., etc. But these are answers that, you know, I'm not an expert. I would like people to ask those questions and to do the research. It will help me as well, you know. It's like the history and the art and the archaeology and the urban landscape, you know, texts and objects, they should be combined.
Yeah. We have many hands up. So first, let's take a question from Mr. Rina Sabar. I don't know if I pronounced it right.
It's Shalom Sabar. It's actually the husband, Shalom Sabar.
Okay. So there's no question, I suppose. Then Yehoshua, has he joined?
No, he's on mute. Shalom, you have to unmute yourself to ask the question. He's a professor from Hebrew University, just Shalom, you should unmute yourself. No, we can't hear you, Shalom.
Can you hear now?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, I'm sorry, the name is my wife's name, so my name is Shalom. So thank you, all of you, for the lectures, were very interesting. Orna, I'm sorry your lecture was too short. I wanted to hear much more. My question is to Ophira, about the dating of the inscriptions. I wrote to you in the chat and I'll repeat it. The counting according to the era of the documents was used by Jews in Islamic lands until the 16th century at least. That's true, but this is not the only counting they used. They used at least 5 or 6 other methods of counting the years. And also in Europe, it wasn't, the counting for the creation was not the only one. So there were communities that continued to use ancient methods of counting, like the Romaniot Jews, the counting since the destruction. So it's true that the Ammonite Jews continued with that till our time, but in the 16th century, when Rabbi David ben Zimra was alive and he decided that this should be the most important method of counting, and by the way, he was born in Spain as well. He's a Spanish Jew. When he suggested that, not everybody switched automatically, and it took some time. And from Cochin, we know the oldest tombstone that we have is also using the method of counting to the documents of this woman, Sarah, I think. Yes, so, by the 16th century, you're right, basically, but it's not so clear cut. That's my point. It's not so clear cut that it's Jews from Europe using it and Jews from Islam are using the other method.
Thank you for this comment. It's very important because I was really trying to find some material about the issue to be a bit more conclusive about it. So it still needs, and I think I said it when I also talked, it still needs a little bit of thinking, to think what does it mean when 14th century you have Anno Mundi calendar system, and then you have later on the era of contracts. But these are questions to be asked, you know, and we still didn't look enough in documents that survived from later periods and so forth and so on. But maybe we can proceed to other.
Yeah, and by the way, about this notion about Jews town, in Europe also we have Jewish communities that are living, let's say, in towns in Spain or in Germany, that it's called Judengasse, or sometimes also town or Jewry, and it means only one street. It doesn't mean a whole town. It can be just one street or two streets, a small quarter, but still it's called in this way. I mean, so it doesn't mean what we think today, a town, a big town that is only of Jews and so on. It meaning where the Jews live. That's what it really meant in the Middle Ages.
Thank you.
Mahmoud, yeah, our host has raised hand. I think he would like to respond.
Yeah, I quickly, first of all, thanks so much for Ophira and Meydad and Orna for such a wonderful panel. My question was a bit of, out of curiosity on the inscription that you mentioned, Ophira, on 1489, that inscription. So I was wondering whether, can you please tell us a little bit more about, what is its content and, to what extent we can, of course, you mentioned that until now, most people have been dismissing it for its veracity. But now once we have it, once we have the image, at least thanks to Tawfiq Zakaria, I wonder to what extent, can we analyze it in terms of its content and also its, scribal specificities and so forth. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, Joshua, did you want to say something about it, or? Yeah, then I will answer, but maybe you can tell us what your thinking is. You're on mute. Unmute yourself.
Oh,
okay.
Hi, Mahmoud. The reason that this inscription was not so people until now, people don't experts and so on didn't take it so seriously because Paradesi Synagogue was considered much older than the Tekkumbhagam Mattancherry Synagogue, and if experts will consider this new inscription, it is not new, but we have now an image or a proof, so it didn't have any sense because every time the Paradesi Synagogue was considered much older than the Tekkumbhagam Synagogue. This is not a simple. It has a reason behind this. It's to show that the Paradesi are more unique and more, and the Malabari Jews are less, and so on. So basically, the inscription itself, it doesn't have any unique over the other inscription. The only unique of it is that it was, or two things, it is a total proof that the Tekkumbhagam Mattancherry Synagogue, which was demolished, and one Paradesi Jew live on it, which usually things like a Jew don't live over a synagogue, but this is a unique case. So this is one point. The other point that is unique, if I'm not mistaken, the name Castiel, yes, Ophira, the name Castiel is on it. So it's another proof that what Ophira told us earlier, that the Castiel family, although their name is outside their origin is outside of Kerala, but they intermix with the Jews, with Kerala Jews. And these two things, it wasn't for the Paradesi, or the white Jews. It didn't mix up, and so this is the importance of the inscription. And although it was written in the David Sasson catalog, but because we didn't have it as a real proof, like a picture or something like this, and it's basically ruining all the theory about the Paradesi Jews. And even there was an article from a Portuguese, yes, Ophira is from Portugal.
Yeah, if maybe I can explain okay. This point here quickly. Yeah, we have in the Portuguese documents, the Inquisition documents, they talk about new Christians brought in Fort Town, also related to Meenakshi Menon's question. New Christians that were obviously Jews converted to Christianity from Judaism. They were working for the Portuguese in Santa Cruz. And in the 1550s, slightly later, there are documents from the Inquisition about complaints about these Jews going to pray in a new synagogue, Esnoga Nova, I think that's the Portuguese expression. And when José Alberto Tavim, a historian who was studying the documents, he thought there must be a Kochangadi synagogue somewhere. That was the old one, and that Kadavumbhagam was the new synagogue, and he completely ignored the fact that Tekkumbhagam was probably the new synagogue at the time, So he was trying to find and kind of unearth this historical ghost of Kochangadi, which who knows whether there was a synagogue, maybe there, maybe it was later, maybe we don't know. But we do know that there were two synagogues at the time and that Tekkumbhagam was already standing. And when I asked Dr. Tavim, why don't you, accept the possibility that it was Tekkumbhagam that was the new synagogue at the time, he said, no, there is something strange about this inscription. I don't believe it, So this is part of the significance. It can change our, the whole perception of of the way we perceive history. And you have to also remember that at the time there was not the wall, the compound wall of the Mattancherry Palace and Temple. So there was no such separation between Santa Cruz and that part of the road. So this is one thing. But Mahmoud, for your question, there are several other interesting answers, even, just leaving aside the historical erasure thing and focusing on what does it mean historically. So first of all, what we have on this inscription is the earliest Hebrew poem documented in Kerala. Okay, this is one thing. There may have been already poets settled there, writing in Hebrew, we don't know, but only later in the 16th century, we start seeing Hebrew poetry, indigenous Hebrew poetry composed in Kerala. The other thing is, and it is still a hypothesis, I am not sure about it, but I think because this synagogue community had a family named Madai, and because this synagogue community has had the oldest Jewish Malayalam women's songs, so-called women's songs, wedding songs, I'm just trying to decipher some more of these songs. The closest literature in Malayalam that is similar to the songs that were kept in Abigail Madai's notebook from Tekkumbhagam, dated 1876, is the Payanur Parte. Okay? And I think, you as historians of Kerala have to start thinking, what does it mean? It is a Patu genre. Nobody includes it when Malayalam literature scholars start looking into, okay, where is our lost Patu genre? Nobody notices there were Jewish songs in that same style, Moda, Educa Rhyme, and Kakrali meter is one thing. There are other similarities. There must have been a performance. What is the name of the Bhagavati, the goddess of the temple of the king of Cochin? Payanur, right? We have evidence, Barbosa writes about Jews in Madai, we have other evidence about Jews in Madai, the Jewish tank, and of course the Geniza records had I think what this Castiel was doing in 1489 is joining forces with Jews of Madai who started migrating southwards and started leaving the area of Madai. And if we go back to Ibn Battuta's reference, when he talks about the mountain, I think he conflates Cochin with the Jews of Madai because they were near Hilly Mountain, where there's a very, very, clear mountain at the top. So this is just a little bit about this inscription, and I think there is more to unearth. The style of writing, it's also very different. If you notice, it's long, right? And it's it's pasted in a strange way. I don't know how it looked like in the original structure. We can only guess. But all the other inscriptions are kind of flat, and this one it is very much different. And here we have to go to the art historians to think about it. The only problem is that we have a picture only now, So if Orna would like to say something about it, I'm happy to stop here.
Yeah, we have a couple of questions, but I don't think we'll have time to answer. One is about how Palli, whether the term Palli is associated with synagogue. That another is about the relation between the Jews and the Konkanis in Kochi. And the third one is about whether there's a Cochin Jew town in Israel. So I don't think we have time. Could probably.
No, I will not. I will just say it very short. Palli is originally the term. Well, it used to describe Jain settlements or Buddhist, places of worship, but it could also mean a settlement place. That's one thing. In Canada, it is Halli, right? So it's there in other inscriptions also. At some point, it started to signal a synagogue, a church, or a mosque in Kerala. The other question about Konkanis and Jews, it's interesting because in the Dutch records, they always talk about Jews, Konkanis, and Chettis moving along together. And Chetti, the word Chetti appears, you have it also in the Payanur Pater, right? Anjuvano Manigramam, the Chetti, Kovadala Chetti, etc., very famous one. And you also have Chetti in the Geniza records. You have City with one Kinabti from Kambhai, So this combination of different types of merchants that the Jews moved along with it goes back to at least, the 12th century. And maybe we can just take a few questions all at once and we'll try to answer them quickly.
Yeah. Now, Ms. Bhaswati Bhattacharya, could you please unmute and ask your question? She had actually...
Yeah. Well, thank you, Ophira, and other panelists for this very interesting presentation. But I have a question especially for Ophira because she mentioned it. As you talk about the white Jews and black Jews in historiography, you also talked about when the boundary walls are being placed in front of this surrounding this Paradesi synagogue. Did it happen at the same time? I'm asking it because in my work on Armenians in India, my hypothesis is that these boundaries when the community, members of the community were dependent on long distance trade by its nature is dependent on other, on the collaboration among many communities, because someone has money, someone doesn't have capital, you lend capital and you take goods on that merchant's behalf on a ship you have created from Europeans or others. So in that way it is an inter-community endeavor, long distance trade, as I understand it. So, but that is changing towards the end of the 18th century when the British have taken over, have access to the revenues of Bengal, and they're kind of the very beginning of the empire, colonial empire. And then Armenians become the subjects of the empire. And then these boundaries, they are not only dependent on trade, there are many other avenues of income, even including land holding. And then the boundaries become important because proximity to the regime, where earlier it was the Mughals, now it's the colonials, and it's also the opportunities and privileges you get as subjects of the colonial empire. There you have to define yourselves, and also, I mean, in the course of that century, you have the census making, where people, ethnic communities are being categorized and put into registered and get a fixed kind of description. So, and that is my hypothesis about Armenians, but I would like to know when it is happening in the case of the Jews.
First of all, it sounds like a very similar process, and I think it's a process and not a point in time.
Yeah.
And it looks like Cochin, because it was colonized much earlier than other parts of India, probably everything happens earlier then. So it's something still to investigate. I don't know, but you gave me now food for thought.
Okay.
Thank you. And I think maybe also Percy and Varghese wanted to ask something. I can just keep it short, I'm sorry. Just find the questions very inspiring.
Yeah, do we have time to take one more last question from Percy Arfi?
Jews, we talk in Malayalam. When we was in Kerala, we talk in Malayalam. There was some changes, some special words, the different. Example, father, Jews say Vava. And as I know, Muslims say Vapa, and the Hindu Achan, if I am correct. But we used Vava. But there are some differences, but usually most of it's like a regular Malayalam we spoke. And if I can show, this is my wife, Talimala. You see, we Jews absorb this custom of Talimala. We have our special design, but it's like Hindu and Christian, Muslim. We have also Talimala.
Yeah, I see that you answered Lakshmi's question about in what language they just communicated. Yeah, so maybe somebody missed that. Yeah, and Percy, maybe your question?
Yeah, thank you so much to all the speakers for the fascinating talks. I had a common question to both Ophira and Orna. If you could give us any information of if you found any information regarding the identity of the builders or the artisans. Is any name mentioned regarding who built these synagogues, especially the inscriptions that you showed, Ophira, that recently Tawfiq Zakaria discovered? Is there any name mentioned about any artisans specifically? I mean, as far as the artisans of the Jewish community that I saw so far, it's only in the Mala synagogue song that an Ayambali carpenter, but we don't know who that person is. Yeah.
From what I know, the artisans were Hindus, the carpenters from the Ashari community, but no names. They never had the credit or signed. There were contracts. They came to the synagogue when there was a renovation, and they followed the instructions. Yeah, so from as far as I know, there's no, even in the ritual objects, there is no signature.
Even in the Mujris Heritage Project, in the Paravur synagogue also, it was done by the Hindu craftsmen from nearby district. Yes. So I think that continues. Dr. Varghese, would you like to, you had your hand raised.
Yeah, I lowered my hand as well as time was getting late. But thank you for this thoughtful reconsiderations that this panel as a whole has offered. I was particularly interested in what Ophira was speaking about the turn in the 18th century, because it was during the 18th century these new legends, stories and histories were basically started getting circulation or produced or getting circulation, which significantly conditioned the historical investigation and its modalities as well as perhaps popular representations. So my question is, can you tell us a bit more about what was the real context of the 18th century, which enabled this sort of historical production? Because you said that the black Jews were one of the treatment against them was that they mingled with the local communities. So it's seen as a defiled community. So can you speak a bit more about this context and the ethnocentrism particularly implicated in this? Thank you.
Thank you for this question, and I promised I will be very quick. So again, I really have to investigate more into this period and the documents, and I start collecting manuscripts, etc., etc. I can tell you for sure that the Wahhabi dynasty was very busy manufacturing manuscripts, okay? And in those manuscripts, for one of the manuscripts that I read recently in Hebrew, it's by Wahhabi the son. It is copied by an Iraqi Jewish merchant, and he is kind of telling the history of the community, but interestingly, it's all based about what the colonial records say. So he is quoting Hamilton, and he is quoting Vosbruch, and he is quoting all the Europeans for building their history. And I think it's about time, that we, not only for Kerala Jews, but also for Kerala, start differentiating between colonial records-based history and local archives-based history. And I know that the sources perhaps, are less abundant, but quantity doesn't mean quality. And I think we have to look into what is produced in the region, whether it's poetry or literature or inscription or tombstones or landscape or buildings or art. This is one thing. And the other thing, about the Jewish community that I noticed that goes beyond Cochin and basically tells, it's a micro history that tells a story of wider processes in Indian Ocean trade and in global trade by and large, which is the processes of separation, segregation, and differentiation based on religious identity and religious differentiation. I think, and you tell me, you historians, but I think that even in Kerala, religious identities were very fluid. You could be both this and that, you could be, there's a wonderful article by Indrani Chatterjee about, connected history and the dream of decolonizing, the history. Can't remember the title precisely, but she talks about Assam actually, Percy, your place, where you still have in the 17th century documents of kings, of royalty who were both Hindu and Buddhists. And she's kind of blaming, the colonial records in differentiating Assamese language from the continuum, Assamese language and culture, from the continuum of, Ladakh and Nepal and Assam and Northeast India, and creating those kind of boundaries and states and different entities. So I think a similar issue is there for the Jews. I don't think the Jews were confused in terms of their identity or anything like that, the religious identity, but I think that the 18th century defined, more rigidly those who are aligned or allied allies of the Ottoman Empire, as opposed to those who work with the colonial forces and companies. And I think that this is partly, what the reason why the Paradesis really wanted to differentiate themselves from the other communities. We even have a song in Jewish Malayalam who talks about how their ship, coming via Egypt and the Red Sea and Yemen, with merchandise was intercepted by the Portuguese enemies, So we have communists that were embedded for so many centuries in the Arab and Muslim trade networks, And now they have to kind of, alienate themselves from those connections. And another hint to that is in a letter exchange between Rahabi and a rabbi from Sana'a, from Yemen. That poor rabbi was a very big rabbi at the time, it's 18th century. He was trying to get his responsa literature, halachic responsa legal literature that goes, back to Mahmoud's work, published, the manuscripts published by Rahabi because of his connections with Amsterdam. He already published 1 or 2 prayer books. Rahabi promised to publish these documents for him, but he never did it. For 20 years, that poor rabbi kept on exchanging letters with Rahabi. And who exchanged the letters? You needed people to go there on boats and give the letters, right? So there were ongoing Yemeni merchants coming and going. By the way, in that letter exchange, it's a nice article in Hebrew about it. I found 2 family members of mine, roaming down the West Coast, one Saadi and one Jamal, was really funny. But the point is that rabbi was so upset. The last letter he wrote was so angry, and he accused, it's David Rahabi, not Yechezkel, he accused him of cheating him, of playing with him. And he never got his manuscripts published. And I was thinking, what was the issue there? Why did Rahabi didn't want, it was like, there was this moment in time where Malabari Jews, where Cochin Jews were in a position to connect the Jews of Yemen with the Jews of Amsterdam. But Rahabi cut this connection. Why? Because Yemen was the Ottoman Empire at that time. They were enemies of the Dutch. They were enemies of the Portuguese. This is my hunch, it's just a very superficial, I still need to write all those things. It will take me another 2 or 3 years, I think, but this is my hunch.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I think we all should take the call for decolonizing very seriously and as early as possible. So I think it is time for us to wind up. Also on behalf of ISHO and Union Christian College, let me take this opportunity to thank our wonderful panel today, Ophira, Meydad, Orna, and Yehoshua. I thank Abhilash, Vijay Varghese, Mahmoud Puria, and all others with ISHO for calling such a wonderful panel. All the participants, Juby John, head of the Department of History at UC College, and all the participants, particularly the students. We had a wonderful participation today. So thank you so much. Good night.
Thank you.
Can I just save the chat with some comments and questions that I didn't have?
Yes, sure.
Thank you very much. Okay, yeah, I saved it. Thank you so much again for having us.
Well, thank you so much, Ophira. It was wonderful to listen to the panel. As someone at the end mentioned, we should have a follow-up session, to discuss more nuances. In 1.5 hours, there's hardly that we can, discuss. So possibly in near future, we can have a follow-up panel.
Inshallah. Yeah, it would be good. I would like to hear from you also, especially on the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries that I'm very poor about. Yeah, thank you so much for a great audience.
So much, Jenny and Judy as well for co-hosting the event.
Definitely.
Our pleasure.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for choosing us.
Oh, hopefully we can continue this engagement.
Yeah, we must. Yeah,
we must.
One day we'll go together to UC College and then.
Yes, you're most welcome. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
We're very close to the airport, so you can always drop in, the moment you land in Kochi.
Yeah.
Please do call. Yeah, thank you.
ഞാൻ കാലടിയിൽ നാലുകൊല്ലം താമസിച്ചിരുന്നു. അവിടെ വീട്ടുകാരത്തിയായി ഫ്രണ്ട്സിന്റെ വീട്ടില് ആലുവ നന്നായി അറിയാം. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.